A biblical view of immigration. We will continue our discussion on that topic today on the Gary DeMar Show. Hello and welcome to the Gary DeMar Show. I'm Joel McDurmon, your host again today, filling in for Gary, and continuing yesterday's topic of a biblical view of immigration and illegal immigration. I was kind of inspired to do this. I wanted to do it for quite some time now, but then yesterday I was handed this book, actually the day before yesterday, on the immigration crisis, Immigrants, Aliens in the Bible, by an Old Testament scholar, James Hoffmeyer. And he goes through most of the Old Testament passages that pertain to immigration, and he shows the distinctions that were made in the Bible. And of course, like I said yesterday, he comes to some conclusions later I don't agree with. We might talk about those tomorrow if I get a chance. But what is important is the meat of the book, which covers the Old Testament law and the Old Testament historical instances of immigration. Yesterday I talked about the distinction made in the Hebrew language between a resident alien, a ger, and in some places in the Hebrew it's ger toshav, a residing alien, a residing foreigner, or someone who dwells in the land. In other words, this is a person who immigrates to a new country and establishes a home, establishes work, etc., etc. And between that word and how it's used in the Bible and other words for foreigners such as nakar or nochrim, depending on how it's used, and the word zar. And those are always pertaining to a lesser status of a resident alien, someone who's not resident alien, someone who is not a resident, someone who's just passing through, someone who is there on business, or someone who is there for who knows what other purpose, but they are not establishing a home, they are not contributing to society, they're not abiding by the laws of the land necessarily, etc. So there is a distinction in the Hebrew language, and it is consistent, and that's the important part to see, is that the law treats them differently and applies the law differently. The resident alien, while he was not necessarily, unless he was circumcised, was not allowed to go into the temple and partake of the religious rituals. He was not allowed to partake of the Passover supper, but yet he was bound to live under the civil laws. He was protected by the civil laws, and so just weights and measures and all those kinds of things. And that's why that particular passage shows up in Leviticus 19 that we covered yesterday, because you'll notice in the end of Leviticus 19, it transitions from talking about treating the stranger by the same law that you're treated by, and then it goes directly into talking about having just weights and measures. So it's obviously talking about the normal business conducted during the day. You were not allowed to cheat the foreigners. You were to treat them like your brother, like your own neighbor. And of course, the reason for this is often stated that it was because you were sojourners in the land of Egypt, and you know what it's like to be in that situation and to receive charity. Not charity as in social benefits, but charity as in the sense of being treated equally under the law. So, nevertheless, the law makes some important distinctions. In Leviticus 25, we're told, in particular verses 35 through 37, we're told that Israelites were not allowed to charge interest on a loan to the poor among them, nor were they allowed to charge interest on a loan to a resident alien living among them. But it distinctly says that they are allowed to charge interest on other foreigners, people who are not resident aliens. So there is this, and that shows up in a very important passage too, not Leviticus 25, but Deuteronomy 15. And that passage, actually, let's just turn there and read that in the brief time that I have here, because it establishes that distinction very clearly and very importantly. Deuteronomy 15, beginning with verse 1. Now this is talking about the 7-year release from debts and slavery. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. And of course, the neighbor in this case would be a resident alien. And the brother, of course, would be an Israelite. But verse 3 says, from a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. And the word foreigner there is, if I remember correctly, the nokar. That is the non-resident alien. So you were not allowed to, you had to cancel debts with everyone in the land, including a resident alien. You did not have to cancel a debt with a non-resident alien or someone who is not legally residing in the land. So you get the point. The basic point is this: there was one standard set for someone who was residing there. There was another standard set for someone who was not, and yet was still a foreigner. What's the point here? The point here is there is a class of people in the Old Testament, in Old Testament law, in God's Old Testament law, that were allowed to immigrate into the land for the purpose of establishing a home, living under the economic benefits of God's covenant. Even if they didn't partake of the ecclesiastical part of that, they were allowed to come establish a new life, work productively, and live under that good law, which of course was the whole point of the civil law to begin with in Deuteronomy 4. It was to be a light unto all the nations, and all the nations were to be jealous of it. The fact that you could charge interest to people who were not in that situation, yet other foreigners, was a symbol of God's domination and God's intentions of dominion for this people to spread across the world. And that's very clear as you read on from verse 3 in chapter 15. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever is of your brothers. And God says, but there shall be no poor among you, because God was going to greatly bless them, if you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God. But in verse 6 it goes on, for the Lord your God shall bless you as he has promised you, and you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow, and you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. So the issue of the distinction between a resident alien and a foreigner pertain to God's vision of dominion for the whole earth. Of course, eventually God's law and God's dominion was to spread over the whole earth, and the Jews failed to do that. So it's important to see these distinctions. Now I have a couple minutes left. Let's back up just a little bit and recall what we were talking about just a while ago. Why, the reason often added on to why they were to treat the resident alien, the sojourner, under the same law, that is, equally under the law. And it is this, that they themselves were sojourners when they were in Egypt. Very interesting story in Genesis 47. You get a picture, as we talked yesterday about Moses on the edge of Edom, and how they asked permission to go into the land, to basically be immigrants through the land, and that were refused. And it showed how highly they valued the property rights, the national boundaries, and the issue of immigration. The same thing shows up when the Israelites were, as the first family was going into Egypt, in chapter 47 of Genesis. And it says this, Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all they have come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is Pharaoh's first question? Here's a family wanting to immigrate into his territory, under his domain. They make it a point to say, we want to immigrate. We have our own flocks. We have our own way of our own wealth. We're not going to be living off of you. We have our own way of making a living. And Pharaoh obviously knows this already, but he asks them the first question is not what party are you going to belong to, who you're connected with. No political. It says, what is your occupation? Are you going to work? Are you going to support yourself? Are you going to contribute to the community? This is the question. And so they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers, and we have come to sojourn in your land. And all they asked for was land to graze their animals on. And of course he gives it to them. That becomes the story that develops later. And out of that, of course, later becomes the Exodus. And God reminds them that you were sojourners at one time. And so the people who come to live among you to work, to establish a genuine family, to establish community, to thrive, those people you are to treat as a brother. But you don't have to treat the others the same way. Well, that's all the time we have to talk about the subject. Great subject today. We'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. Thank you for joining me.
For more related to this topic, check out God versus Socialism, a biblical critique of the New Social Gospel. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.